Deconstructing the unity of the self. Over the last 100 years or so, mainstream science has fairly consistently deconstructed all 5 of Ramachandran's characteristics of the self. We'll now look at each of these characteristics and see what mainstream science has had to say about them. Starting here with the unity of the self. Daniel Dennett questions the solidity of the self. In fact, he says, it is gappy like consciousness, quote. We saw that while consciousness appears to be continuous, in fact, it is gappy. A self could be just as gappy, lapsing into nothingness as easily as a candle flame is snuffled, only to be rekindled at some later time under more auspicious circumstances. Are you the very person whose kindergarten adventures you sketchily recall, sometimes vividly, sometimes dimly? Are the adventures of that child, whose trajectory through space and time has apparently been continuous with the trajectory of your body, your very own adventures? That child with your name, a child whose scrawled signature on a crayon drawing reminds you of the way you used to sign your name, was that child you, end quote. We'll be looking at Dennett's theory of the self in more detail in Unit 3. And later still, we'll be questioning his dismissal of any notion of unity and continuity between the adult and childhood self. David Rose focuses on the clinical phenomenon anosognosia, in which various forms of self-awareness can be lost. He says, quote, "What can we learn about the neural representation of the self from such cases?" Gaetano points out that there are many different aspects of self-awareness that may be lost in any one person. These losses can be restricted to one narrow area of self-knowledge, such as the fact that the subject has a paralyzed left arm, poor social skills, or aphasia, i.e. not being able to speak. The anosognosic symptoms can also be multiple, varying from person to person and recover to varying extents over different timescales, end quote. Thus, contrary to our assumption that the self is a natural unity, neurology indicates that it is made up from different neural components, and that one or more of these can malfunction independently of the rest, thus dissolving the self's unity. What this indicates is a polymodular basis for the self. Rose says, quote, Gaetano concludes by classifying the symptoms into 4 syndromes, each centered on damage to regions of higher integrative and polymodal cortices in the 4 lobes. Self-awareness depends on the integration of thinking and feeling that occurs in those regions, and there is thus no single self-representation in the brain. To a first approximation, then, the relative independence of the mental blind spots that can occur in self-awareness suggests a polymodal basis for the self in neurologically intact people. Multiple mechanisms exist, each of which monitors the activity of a restricted domain of the brain to generate self-awareness of the functioning of that subset of neural mechanisms and that subset alone, end quote. Thus, the self has multiple independently functioning centers in the brain. From a polymodular self, many studies and theories have moved on further to envisage many selves or many self-awarenesses coexisting within a single individual. For example, Sperry's 1984 analysis of split-brain patients led him to conclude that they have two selves, one in each hemisphere. Further, Marcel's 1993 survey of various kinds of anosognosia and blindsight, as well as his psychophysical investigations of intact subjects, led him to suggest that multiple self-consciousnesses can occur commonly. Any single sensory quale can drive several parallel mechanisms, each leading to behavioral outcomes that are empirically identifiable as independent by asking the subject to respond in different ways, such as blinking, speaking, or pressing a key. Different sensitivities to the stimulus are demonstrable. Because they are cognitively penetrable, the experimenter tells the subject to respond when the subject sees the stimulus. These higher-order mechanisms each involve conscious awareness of the stimulus, the content of the lower-order phenomenal sensation. There can thus be several independent consciousnesses about the same stimulus at any one time. This multiplicity, however, only applies when paying attention to oneself or when asked to introspect about one's own sensations or inner states. If attention is directed outwards, such as in performing some complex skill, like driving along a busy street, then consciousness is more unified. There may be a single self, though Marcel is vague about what exactly that is. But self-awareness comes via multiple mechanisms, end quote. Perhaps the ultimate deconstruction of the self is to be found in faith traditions such as Buddhism and 18th century empirical philosophers such as David Hume, both of which conceptualize the self as nothing but a bundle of feelings, sensations, mental states, etc. According to Rose, they claim, quote, that there is no such thing as the self as postulated in the atomist Platonic Christian idea of a soul or ego. Instead, you are just a bundle of various feelings, thoughts, abilities, processes, mental states, and so on. Yourself is just the collection of abilities you have at any particular time. For Hume, the feeling of personal identity was merely an illusion based on the memory's production of a sequence of similar ideas of successive instants in time. For Buddhists, it is the continuity of the pattern of habits accumulated through ontogeny and phylogeny. Modern theories of binding suggest more mechanistic or real emergent explanations. The point here may be that there is no self within the person, although there may be an individual person. But who is this I? The answer may come from moving up or down a level of description. Thus, social constructionists may see the self as existing at a higher societal level, whereas reductionists prefer to look to lower levels, such as the constituent mental states, all having their neural bases in common in the same brain. Finally, Linus says the self is like Uncle Sam, a useful symbol, but not a real person. End quote.